We're live. Good evening, everyone. This is the Sacred Mystery School of Egypt. So welcome. We have a full night again tonight, and I hope you enjoy the way this all came about. I personally went to Egypt in 2016, and while I was there, I did have quite a few experiences, which ties in with being a shamanic practitioner of Egyptian Mystery School. So I will share those along with everything that I have tonight. So I'll bring it to a more personal degree, I guess. The origin of the Egyptian Mystery School is from 3,000 years ago in paper. However, the foundation of the mystery taught in the Egyptian Mystery School is much, much older than that. It just depends on how deep you want to dig. If you just want to dig on the surface and you just want a little bit of information on it, for the people that are curious, that would be the date. But it predates much older than that. The great teachers who presided over the Egyptian Mystery School I've come from an extraordinary place. It's been theorized that the masters were actually from Atlantis. And the knowledge that Atlantis was sharing with all the other cultures of the world was much older than them. And so we're going back to the Lemurians. The Atlantis civilization made their way to Egypt and civilized Egypt. And so in the myths where they say that Thoth came and brought about agriculture and wisdoms and letters and writing, well, Thoth was not so much as a god as a person who had knowledge that the common people didn't. And that's why he was elevated as the status of god. To support the theory that it's much older than 3,000 years ago, we're going to look at the Sphinx first. There are several temples in Egypt, 13 in total. And one of those temples is the Sphinx. Now, at the base of the Sphinx, you can now find that it's been proven that the erosion of the Sphinx was caused by water. And so you can find small shells and small fossilized sea life called mobilites at the base. And so this reinforced the theory that the Sphinx was built previous to the flood. Now, pre-Diluvian construction, how do we date that? Well, the flood would have been at the sinking of Atlantis. So that means that the Sphinx itself was there previous to that. And so if you've ever seen the Sphinx, now it's nowadays not as imposing as it was maybe even 100 years ago, because now we have huge towers and buildings that are 60, 70 stories high. And so the Sphinx in proportion to those is quite small. Now, what's interesting is that the proportion of every structure in Egypt is very well proportionate. So therefore, when there's a body, the structure of what a body looks like is maintained. But with the Sphinx, however, the proportion of the head is too small for the body of the Sphinx. And so the Egyptologists suppose that the original head was a lion's head, and that a common practice amongst the rulers of Egypt was to use something that was already built and then simply put their name instead of the originator's name. And so the head of the lion was transformed into the head of one of the pharaoh. And so although it's associated to Cheops because it's his face on the Sphinx, the original face was not his. Now, in one of the books that I researched, which is very well researched, they estimate the building of the Sphinx at 69,000 years ago, in order for the first ceremony to be conducted as the light of Vega appeared in the sky. Now, we're going to talk about the zodiac a little bit, because the zodiac is an intricate part of the mystery school. The Sphinx, being a lion, was originally created in a cycle of the zodiac when the sun roses into Leo. Now, if you know anything about the zodiac, is that every year the sun moves 1 degree further into the other sign until eventually, once the cycle is complete, a total of 2,160 years, the sun then rises in a different sign. And so the Sphinx, being a lion, was built in that cycle. However, each cycle totals about 25,920 years. So it could have been built in this cycle, but being that it's 69,000 years ago, it was built 3 cycles ago. So a very, very, very long time ago. Now, as you know, right now we're shifting into a new era. There's discussions as to when is this era actually shifting. Now, some people are saying the Pisces era, which was led by Jesus, the fisher of men, started at year 0. So we won't transfer into the Aquarian age until 2,160 years. However, it's not because the leader of the Pisces era was born at year 0 of our calendar that was necessarily when this era began. We have to refer more to the zodiac table. So some people say that it's going to happen soon. Some people say that was what the Mayan calendar was calling for 2012, the change of that era, the end of the Pisces era and the beginning of the Aquarius era. And some people say it started in the 60s. However, we're on the cusp of this change. And the Aquarius leader is Master Saint Germain, the Ascended Master who leads us into transmutation and transformation. This is very important because that's the whole basic of the mystery school. It's our personal transformation as human into spiritual beings. So if you're curious, who was the leader of the Aries era? It was Moses. Moses was the shepherd of men. And for the Taurus, that area was led by Seraphis Bey. So for those of you who actually know Ascended Masters, know that all of these people transformed the world, completely changed the face of the world they lived in. Moses freed the Jews from slavery in Egypt and completely changed the face of the world for the Egyptian and for the Hebrews. And as much as Jesus did, he transformed what the Jews were into what became the world of Christianity, influencing the entire world. Now, is that for better or worse? That remains to be discussed. But the point was that their teaching and the way they changed the way they lived their lives and the people around them as leaders of these people made a huge difference. For the Gemini era, we're going really far back now. But the Gemini era, it was led by the 5 Cetus twins that were the base of the human race. So we're going further and further back until we go into the Lion era, which was led by Thoth. So the pronunciation, the writing of Thoth is Thoth. So it's not the thinking Thoth, but Thoth, what is considered a god in Egypt. Now, the pyramid has no particular entrance. Today, if you go to Egypt, you can enter the king's chamber, the queen's chamber, and the chamber below. But those entrances were made by an Arab person who came to seek the treasures. And so technically the pyramid was built with no actual entrance. The actual entrance was through a series of tunnels, through a labyrinth under the Sphinx. The initiates, as you'll see in the mystery schools, were led by mysteries and by teachings. And they had to prove their understanding through a series of initiation. And one of those initiation was crossing the labyrinth of the Sphinx to enter the pyramid. The last initiation being inside the pyramid itself. So when the initiate was ready and understood the teachings behind all the mysteries, he could make his way inside the pyramid, and there he could do the 3-day ascension ceremony. I will be describing those just a little bit later on. So now, the pyramid is therefore not so much as a tomb for kings, but more as a womb where you live your second birth. And so all through the process of the mystery school, you're transforming. And as you complete your learning and you apply these learning into actual way of life, you're entering the pyramid, which is the new womb, in which you die. Not a physical death, but the death of the human animalistic part of you, to be reborn into the human spiritual you. And so this process took 3 days. We were lucky that some of the Greek philosophers were able to go through the Egyptian mystery school to, in their writing, bring that forward to us today. So Pythagoras was one of the ones that went through the mystery school, was an initiate, and also was Plato. And so Plato described these 3 days inside the pyramid, and then a further 3 days coming out of the tomb, the sarcophagus, in order to then re-enter the world as a full-grown human soul. During the ceremony, you would obtain your divine soul name. So you often hear people say that they were named a certain name by their teachers or their masters, or and that name has particular meaning to your soul, not so much in the physical world and materialistic world. Now, in 2016, I was able to enter the King's Pyramid. I was able to lay in the sarcophagus. And however, the actual ritual of doing so, it requires preparation, and the preparation was not really there. What the beauty of this is people are thinking, oh, well, if I want to become an initiate to the mysteries, do I have to travel to Egypt in order to go through this ceremony, in order to have this ascension? No, you do not. We practice ascension ceremonies in Mount Shasta, and we'll practice one in our trip to Ireland. But personally, mine came during my shamanic initiation in Peru in 2017. I had undergone a rigorous training and purging of the emotional body through my 800-kilometer walk in a Camino in Spain. And then I left from there and I went to Peru. And there I received my shamanic initiation of 3 days, where the experience is exactly the same. So it's not the place where you do it in, it's how you prepare yourself for the experience, for this transformation. Where does this all come from? This comes from Hermes Mercurius Trismegistus. What does that mean? The Greek name is Hermes. However, is also referred to as Thoth or Hermes Thoth. And in some books, he was even called Enoch for the Hebrews. So remember when I always say, you know, in some places your name is John, your name in French is Jean, and then in Spain it's Juan, and you're like, okay, these are all different names. And yet you're still the same person. Well, this is the same idea. The master, the teacher, the first initiator, his name was Thoth. But we know most of what we know from the Egyptian mystery school from what the Greeks wrote about it. And so they transformed his name to Hermes. Trismegistus means that he's the great of three things. He's the greatest of the kings. He's the greatest of the wise. And he's also the greatest of initiators. Now, he wrote 42 books. These books, all related to esoteric science, and most of them have been lost, but they have been studied by Plato and Pythagoras, so that's how we know about them. The earliest records left were the pyramid text of Egypt, which is why a lot of people think the mystery school started 3,000 years before Jesus. But really, it all started with the books of Thoth. Now, the 42 books contain 4 astrological books. The Order of the Fixed Star, a book about the sun and the moon, their rising and their setting, meaning the 13 months of the moon cycle, and within those months, the cycle of the moon, and also the sun cycle, which is the equinox, the solstice, and all of those things. There was a book on the hymn of God and the regulation of the king's life. There was a book on hieroglyphics, on cosmography, geography, description of Egypt, the charting of the Nile. equipment of the priest, and the places consecrated to them, and what is to be used for the sacred rites. There were 2 books on training the initiates. Why is 2 books? Because in every mystery school, you'll always find that there's a lesser initiate and a higher initiate, which is more of an adept. And so the book on training was for the 2 levels. In between those 2 levels, the initiate had to prove his worthiness and that he would keep the secrets of the mysteries, because to advance further, you had to preserve the sacredness of what was contained in the teaching so they wouldn't be corrupted. And what does it look like when it gets corrupted? Well, it looks like what happened to the Aztecs, right? We go from sacrificing our human material form for the spiritual form, but they actually sacrifice people for real. So it's important to really understand the mysteries in order to not lead people falsely, and not to take a ritual and apply it wrongly. There were 10 books on Egyptian worship, 10 books of laws, gods, and training the priest, and 6 medical books that studied the structure of the body, of disease, of instruments used, actual medicine, and one on women. So our physiology being so different than men, we had our own book. Now, the important book, the book that we are interested in, is the Book of Thoth, because it contained the secret of regeneration of humanity, the key to immortality. Now, interestingly enough, in many sources, they agree that the book, during the destructions and invasion by the Romans and later by the Christian, trying to convert the Egyptians to Christianity, most of the books were destroyed. And so they realized that unless we destroyed the books, people are going to still refer to them. And so before they were completely destroyed, some of them were buried in the desert. And some of them, the priests, some Egyptian priests, ran away with them. These Egyptian priests then became the gypsies in Europe. So the sacred book of Thoth is the equivalent of the actual major arcana of the tarot. Now, where did I get that from? The link was made once they found an actual tablet of Isis, the Bambine Tablet. This Bambine Tablet has 21 different characters, the 21 cards of the tarot, evolving in the Sacred Mystery School, and that's how it got transformed. And the mystery of the teaching being lost became a card game. But originally, that was the summary of what the initiates would have to travel through and work through in order to find their divine self. The Book of Thoth that has survived and that was found and translated was the Book of Vision. Much like the Toltec, he was the first man who went through a meditation, freed himself from his body, and had an out-of-body experience. When that happened, the experience you're going to see, I'm going to describe it, is exactly the same as the Toltecs, who were using the teaching of the Nuas. They saw the same thing, they experienced the same thing, and they received the same exact knowledge. So, the vision and this out-of-body experience, I don't know about the people listening, but you're welcome to write your comments. I'll read them and I'll answer some of the questions if you have them while we're streaming. I've had the out-of-body experience. I've been able to go to Egypt from my body staying in Canada. I was able to travel through the stars. I was able to travel through time, through space, and to the point where I can now do so even while I'm awake. So when I was in the Temple of Philae in Egypt, while I was physically in 2016, I was seeing what happened in that place 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. I could see how alive it was. I could see it covered in trees and flowers. I could see the women walking, how they were dressed. Time and space is only linear because we are stuck in a physical body. If you're able to pierce through that veil of the material form, you are able to then tap into different times in the same place, or travel to different place from the same time. Okay, so I was in Egypt, but I was 6,000 years ago in Egypt, or I'm in my house and I travel to Egypt. In the present time, we're a past time. Once you are able to transfigure your physical body, there is no limitation of time and space because your soul is immortal and lives outside of time and space. Now, in this vision, Thoth meets a dragon who then transforms itself into this amazingly bright light that shines almost like a sun, that it's hard to look into it. And this dragon explains first the creation of the world and that it all came from the word. So if you're interested in the creation of the world, please see my talk on the Trinity. And that we are made in God's image, meaning that we're made of light, made of energy. We're not the animalistic form. God does not have 2 legs and 2 arms and a head. That's what happens when you incarnate on earth. Our true nature, the soul nature, is that of light and energy. And that is how we were created in the image of God. Now, as we saw God and the governors create things, create the earth and create out of light and shadows, different things, we were interested and curious. And that's when we fell into matter. So again, even for the Egyptian, the fall from grace predates the Hebrew myth of Adam and Eve. It goes all the way back to the soul actually entering the materialistic body and being cut off from the grace of God. So by forgetting that we are immortal and being connected to this energy and savoring our senses, we, at the same time, started believing this illusion to be the real world and forgot who we were, the divine beings that inhabit us. So the vision of Thoth continues by saying that the body was hermaphrodite, meaning it was both male and female. And it was only much later that eventually the body started forming into opposite male and female. But the soul remained androgynous. It remains both male and female. It's complete. It is full. So the vision that Thoth received continues to explain that to love your body, meaning to love the sensation, to enjoy the warmth of a fire or the sunlight or the cold of a refreshing water, all of these is what traps our immortality, our soul inside this body, because we're enjoying the pleasures. We're animalistic in nature. And I don't mean by that we just go around and not following rules, but we're following our animal nature in the sense that we're trying to live by our senses. So by food, by touch, by smells, by what we see. It is the 7 governors that created this are then kind of our judge when we try to pass from this material world into the spiritual world. These 7 governors are living around us, are imbued in everything that surrounds us. And the idea behind the mystery school is that we have to go through the initiation of the 7 governors in order to obtain the 7 harmonies. That liberates the soul and also releases us from the continual reincarnation that we are forced to go through until we learn finally how to live in harmony and not in animalistic needs. You can review the teachings of Mary Magdalene, which teaches you about freeing yourself from the 7 governors, and Kuan Yin, who teaches us about embracing the 7 harmonies. The 7 governors being lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, and pride, which are the 7 sins. And the 7 harmonies are mercy, kindness, compassion, gentleness, loving, forgiving, and truth. So in order to be the animistic nature, we need to let go of all these sins and embrace all the harmonies. In Dante's Divine Comedy, he inspired himself on the 7 governors. And that's why he describes in the Divine Comedy and the Inferno these 8 spheres that the soul must travel through in order to regain its immortality and live in the presence of the light of the world. The order might be a little bit different, but it's the same idea. In the mysteries, you will be confronted with the moon, which is your ability to increase and decrease, which refers to gluttony. The second sphere is Mercury, which is abandoning machination and deceits and craftiness, which is the equivalent of sloth and fraud. And then you reach the sphere of Venus. For Dante, that was the first sphere, but for the mystery school in Egypt, it was the third, is lust and passion. The fourth circle was the sun, and it's all about ambition, which translates to pride. The fifth sphere was Mars, and Mars is the vastness, the profound boldness. It's also the god of war, and so that would be wrath. And for the sixth sphere was Jupiter, and the sense of accumulation of riches and relates to greed and avarice. And the final circle was Saturn, which is the gate of chaos. And so you must return all wishes of falsehood and plotting, which is treachery or envy. If you were able to let go of all of these things, then you reach the eighth sphere, which is the Milky Way, where the soul can be finally free of all illusions and rejoin the light. This would end your cycle of reincarnation. So as the Buddhists say, you would enter nirvana. Now, this wheel, it's based on a wheel, and the wheel keeps on turning. And so if you're unable to reach the eighth sphere, you are sent back down with your lessons that you need to learn. Obviously, if you didn't pass gluttony, that will be your lesson that you came to learn. And as you go through the different sphere, you don't unlearn what you've learned in the previous life. You keep gathering knowledge until you finally receive enlightenment and are able to pass the 7 rings to obtain the 8th sphere. And so even for the Egyptian, reincarnation is viewed as a place of suffering because of our attachment to those senses. Thoth is then instructing humans to learn about their spiritual nature and free themselves from these cycles. Any ascended masters like Jesus, Buddha, Serapis Bey, Lord Lento, Thoth is magnificent in what he's learned from his vision. And now that he's learned it and he's free and he knows the truth and that's rung through him, he wanted all humans to experience this love, this light, and this peace. And so that's why he wrote the book about his vision and all the other books that followed. The idea was to teach us this, but this is not an easy concept to be teaching when thousands of years ago, you didn't really have technology, you didn't have science that would explain atoms, that would explain energy, that would explain that your body is made of stars. The stars are the atoms, that the energy flowing through you, this light that is part of you and everything, is the energy between the atom, is the quantum energy. So in today's world, we're able to explain a lot of those concepts with actual science, with actual discoveries that were made, and that makes it more potent or more real. But at the time when they were teaching all these things, they didn't have the science behind it. And so they were using stories to explain the unseen. So how would you explain atoms? And when you see stars and the connection of the stars is united and there's no space, it's difficult. And so that's when they started teaching with myths, parables, and they're only that unless it is explained at the higher understanding. It's just the same as all the fairy tales out there. You can see the fairy tales and say, I don't know, if you're thinking about the Disney ones, what I get from that is girls are weak and they all need a prince to save them, and they all pretty and sing. So if you're not pretty, forget it. You're not going to get rescued by a prince. And so, but you're missing the point that a lot of the information through Disney has been taken out, and the actual stories of the fairy tales are much darker, and they were there to teach the children and to keep them interested. You were trying to teach them through stories. In the same way, when we look at ourselves as human, we are like teenagers in our spiritual development. We're not much further than that. And so in order to captivate us, in order to keep us alive and keep us curious, those stories are there to try and guide us through the different principles. So shamanism is really basically the invention of symbolism. All shamanism is based on symbolism, on imagery, on stories. It is part of how we transfer knowledge. It's how we share what we have with others. And with imagery, perhaps it breaks down barriers of cultures and different beliefs, because we're telling a story, so that people are not going to stop and be stuck with certain words. They're just listening to the story. And then if you see the curiosity, then you can explain the meaning behind what happens and behind the imagery. So mummification, people for the longest time thought that the pharaohs were being mummified in order to preserve their body in their next life, which actually is not the case. The process of mummification is to prevent the soul from reincarnating. And so it can finish its learning while it is there, and then can move straight to the 8th sphere and not have to reincarnate again. I mean, think about it. Every time you reincarnate, you have to learn to walk, to eat, to poop in the right place, to talk. You have to learn to count. You have to learn to write. We're spending a lot of time just learning basic knowledge. Then after all that, then comes the battle of the senses again. And we have to fight with all these different things that we experience. Our body changes, our hormone changes, and then we have to relearn everything every time. So the idea of the mummification of the pharaoh in the Egyptian mystery school was to prevent the soul from completely detaching from the body, as it still had a body present that wasn't destroyed. So the soul, because it's still alive and it's immortal, could continue learning, and then when it was ready, could free itself and actually access the 8th sphere. Reincarnation was only the path for the imperfect souls. And so Pharaoh, being the representation of God on earth, had to be perfect. And so its soul couldn't be allowed to be reincarnated because he was the personification of God. So that's why they were mummificated. Now, the ideals for the initiate were that they had to learn about things from the unseen of the human eye. In order to explain the teachings, the Book of the Dead was eventually written. The Book of the Dead is based partly on what is called the text, the pyramid text that I referred to at the beginning of the talk. And then eventually, different parts of Egypt had different gods, all different names, but with the same attributes. So the book was a little complicated at first, but eventually settled on a form, a certain way of building the story. It's called the Book of the Dead, but more rightly so, it should be the illustration of what the journey of the soul must take to be free. And so it's not about once you die, it's about while you're alive that your journey should start. But the common people of the population of Egypt at the time, note that I'm not talking about current Egyptian people, right? We're talking about 5,000 years ago. At the time, were illiterates and were just farmers or raising animals and things. So they weren't educated into the mysteries. But they understood from working in the tombs and seeing that there was something more. And so the Book of the Dead was read to the dead people to guide their soul. But the principle was more to be read while you're alive, to do your soul journey while you're still on earth, to die of the material death and be reborn as a spiritual being. The main actors, the main teachers of the Book of the Dead was Amun-Re, Osiris, Horus, Set, Isis, Nephthys, Thoth, Geb, Nut, Nun, Anubis. Now, there's two ways that the soul can travel: the solar way or the moon way. One is by water and one is by earth travels. Now, you're going to see when the actual initiates are going through the mystery school, they first need to travel on foot, and then they can, while they're doing their second round of initiation, they can travel by water. So there was two ways, but the one way had to be done by earth, and the second way had to be done by water. Now, it was put together into 5 parts. The first part teaches the initiate to beat death by sacrificing ego. The second part is to recognize its own divinity that lives inside of us and the fact that God's in you and therefore you are God. The third part is the transfiguration or the resurrection as the soul infused human. So you're still in your body, but now rather than operating from ego, you're operating from soul. This space cannot be occupied by both. It cannot be shared. You're either one or the other. And this is why in the Toltec and Egyptian tradition, you are called a warrior, because the soul is always trying to win this war against the animistic nature. It's very tempting, you know, to live with the senses. So you must always come back and choose with your free will to act differently or to live differently. Now, the fourth part reveals the 7 governors that is seen in the vision by Thoth. And the path through which you acknowledge the governor and you beat the governors and pass the threshold is to reach enlightenment is through 21 doors. Those 21 doors are the 21 cards of tarot. All right. And the final part, the 5th part of the Book of the Dead, is you now inherit this new world, because the mystery school tells us, just like the Toltec tells us, that heaven is on earth, but only if you live a certain way. And if you live in pain, if you live in drama, it's hell. But if you live in peace, and if you live in love and compassion and forgiveness, then it's heaven. And so the final part was that you had to protect this knowledge as you inherited the heaven on earth, and preserves its teaching, and maybe perhaps become a teacher yourself. Now, Isis plays one of the most important role out of all of the different deities, because she is wisdom. That's what her name translates into. She's one of the 5 gods who are called the sons and daughters of Ham, and they're represented by the 5-pointed star in the Saqqara temple. Isis has links with the Mayas, interestingly enough, and so somehow her teachings come from beyond Egypt, right? She's already part of the myths as we enter the mystery school, so the teachings come from much further out than that, right? Remember that. And so she was dressed in a garment. Now, if you see tablets and inscription and Egyptian drawings, you always see the women dressed in white linen. However, in the Book of the Dead, in the inscriptions inside of coffins and sarcophagus, and also on the tablet, she is dressed with 4 colors: black, red, white, and yellow. The same actual colors used in the medicine wheels of the Native Americans. The reason why she is so important is because she's the only one to have been able to conjure Ra, the invisible god of eternity, by calling a secret and sacred name. So she has power, magical powers of reconstitution and transfiguration. So her table, the table of Isis, the Bambine table, explains those 21 doors that one must travel in order to die as a human animal and reborn as a human soul. And so the path is to teach the initiate what is expected of them. And the journey starts with the Fool or the Dreamer, depending on which deck you're using. The Fool could be the Juggler, or it could have other name, but it has no numbers. And some people say it's number 22, and some people give it the number 0. However, the Fool is not a door. The Fool is the initiate starting its journey towards this evolution and this transfiguration. And he passes through the 21 doors. So the Fool is literally the person living their life without their spiritual nature, and that's why they're fools. And so as you embark on your journey through the tarot, you then remember your divinity, and then you work towards gaining that. And so your transformation through each door, through each domain, through each initiation grows. The fool in the Egyptian mystery is often referred to as Anubis, because Anubis is the one standing at the door of the both worlds, so between the light and the dark, the subconscious and the conscious. And so he becomes, at the end of his journey, the earth shaman who has transformed and awakened to the power of the healing heart. Just like the Toltec, the mystery school is based on the power of the healing heart. So it's not just one or two things that is the same. Everything is the same. So it's really, really amazing that based on two different continents, separated by an ocean on either side, they still have the same basic teaching, using different names. However, the principles are always the same. So the first thing that the initiate will face is Nekbet. Nekbet is the crown of the Trinity of the Egyptian cosmology. And she's referred to as the magician because magicians were known to have wands or scepters or sticks. She holds the caduceus key, which is the staff with the two snakes intertwined with the wings at the top. The two snakes represent the shedding of the old skin, but it also represents the DNA change and represents the mounting energy through the Kundalini force. She is the representation of our ancestors or past lives and everything that came before. And so she is there to instruct you as you are seeking the truth. So a lot of it had to do with medicine at this point and learning about where you came from and where that has brought you to this day. There is, through the magician, an important phase of the initiate had to go through. They had to learn about their past, not so much distant past, but their own past, because that has made them what they are today. And so they had to comprehend their animalistic nature in order to let it go. So the study started at this point. Eventually, when they were ready, they would move to Nephthys. Nephthys is the maiden of the trilogy of the cosmology. She's the high priestess in the tarot. She's the veiled sister of Isis. By that, we mean that she is veiled and therefore the truth is hidden. She represents the subconscious. And so now that you know where your physical body has come from and how it's grown, now you have to go and explore this, what is happening through this growth that you went through. Right now, I'm working with a group on the online activity, and they're exploring their timeline. And that's the part of their physical timeline. They have to know where they've been and how they've come to now, as they see the high priestess, how they've internalized the messages in their subconscious of what happened to them when they grew up. This is to bring back insight and develop your intuitive nature. It's also to understand what's in your heart. The idea of knowing how deep your subconscious goes helps expand your actual consciousness because you become aware of it and then it grows. Nephthys, or the priestess representing Nephthys, would teach how to work with the ancestors through vision, dream, and the sacred rites. Now, you had to learn about them first to now learn to work with them. There was also a purification of the body that would take place at this point in time in the initiation. The rigorous discipline of an initiate is they would undertake. Don't forget, they have to give up their animalistic nature, meaning that they have to completely change their physical body and habits, but also clear their mental and emotional habits as well. So there was quite a rigor of discipline to follow. Following these credo and these way of life would help one to develop the faculties of intuition and also of reason. It would also allow you to gain access to the hidden force of the universe. Now, I regularly teach mediumship, and people tell me why. It was because it's important. You need to know how to communicate with the other side. That's where everything is real. That's also where you can do tremendous work with your ancestors and the people that have passed on. And you can do this work at a family level, community level, culture level. So there's nothing stopping you once you know how to progress and how to interact with the soul groups that are on the other side. At the same time, working with the soul groups also helps you understand your own nature and get support and guidance. And so the initiates had to learn of all these things and all these interactions in order to finally be able to free themselves, um, to become, the soul infused person. And finally, the third of the trio of the Trinity goddess is the Virgin Mother, Isis. She's the Empress in the tarot. Her work is to take you apart and to rebuild you like she did. That's the myth of Osiris. Osiris is cut into 14 pieces, and her job is to go around and gather all the pieces back together. It's interesting because the only piece of the body that she cannot find is the phallus, and the phallus would have been the equivalent of lust or sexual desires or something more primitive, and it's replaced with a golden one. She helps us review our lives through the sacred eye, but this time not of judgment, but more of love and compassion. So the first look that you look at your life, you will judge yourself harshly. This is when Isis brings her love, her unconditional love, her deep love for you, and teaches you how to forgive yourself, because they're not things to be ashamed of, but more things to learn from. And so this love is felt through our connection to earth and life, plants and animal and nature. It's by feeling connected back to the world around us that we can feel the love that surrounds us. She's the mother that loves us, cares for us, and helps us in the end love ourselves and forgive ourselves. The initiate would learn about the chakras, about energy, about aligning themselves to the central channel, and in order to receive more light. The idea through this continuous training is that the initiate must spiritualize the matter, which means that the space between the atom must be filled with light. And so exercises of meditation and of exchanging energy between Earth and the sun was continuously part of their training. Then we get to the Emperor. Khnum is the master craftsman. Now, he works out of one of the temples to restructure your DNA. We've heard from Cryon that we have 13 layers of DNA. Through all these layers of DNA, we are holding the time and space from previous time, from our ancestors, from our lineage. And it can be changed. It's all energy, right? So if you go back to the fact that you're made of energy, then you can change the energy. So there's work being done on the initiates to replace their organs for light organs. Organs without scars, organs without history, organs without emotional drama contained inside of them. There's a cleansing of all the energy of all the body parts. And Khnum is the one who would teach how to restructure your body in harmony. This alchemy of transformation, we're using the element of water, air, earth, and fire. So there is, at one of the temple, a point where the initiates had to swim inside of a tunnel and find their way out. And there was two possibilities. You could transfer into a dark room, which would lead you to the right exit. Or if you chose the light instead, you would land into a place where there was a whole bunch of crocodiles. And so therefore failed the initiation. Whenever the initiation was failed at this point, I don't know if you were allowed to continue. That's missing from my research, but I believe that if you entered the wrong door, you obviously didn't get the idea. And so maybe not completely kicked out, but definitely would have to go back and restart the training. And so there was such a rite of passage made by water, by air, by earth, and by fire. Now, you have to gain insight. From the insight, you get awareness. And from the awareness, you gain consciousness. And so part of the organs that were being transformed, was also your heart. Now, there's the physical heart that sits in your chest that pumps the blood, but there's also a higher heart. And that heart is what unifies the materialistic nature with your spiritual nature. So the idea of this transformation was for eventually for these two hearts to start merging into one another, growing bigger, allowing more space to enter, and to beat as one. And so then the initiates would be taught to follow the Hierophant or the Pope or the Sphinx in this case. The Sphinx is called the builder of bridges. It's what bridges heaven and earth. In this sense, bridging your physical nature with your spiritual nature into one. You start understanding that life is much more than just the current life. And the life lesson that you came to learn are because of what happened to you in past lives and this life. In tests, the initiates would have to resolve what has happened to them and what they were supposed to learn from them. Once you have learned this lesson, you are to apply it in your everyday life. So it was very important that the initiate weren't judged on a moment or just during a tribunal. They were judged on the way that they talked, the way that they acted. They were observed all the time. They were also observed by what they decided to eat and what they listened to and what they fed their mind. And I often say this in a lot of the presentations I do. This is really important. What you feed your body is also energy. So what kind of energy are you putting inside of you? Are you feeding yourself spiritual things, or are you feeding yourself garbage? So in the native tradition, a shaman will salute you by saying, all my relations. Now, when we say that, we are saying and acknowledge that inside of you, everything you ate, from the meat, from the vegetables, to the things you did, everything that is you is amplified by what has been absorbed by you. And so when we salute all my relation, we're saluting everything that has become a part of you. And so it's important to ask yourself, what is it that I am filling myself with? Now, we moved on to the Alchemical Marriage, which in the tarot cards is the lover. This marriage is the marriage between your higher consciousness and the subconscious. It's the reconciliation of the light and the dark within you, the conscious and the subconscious becoming one. And so you're no longer being driven by intentions or by desires that are not part of your nature, or that you don't understand where they're coming from. And so this in the book of stories, in the Book of the Dead and all that, this is the reconciliation between Set and Horus. Horus fights Set because Set killed his father and then tried to take Horus's place as the rightful king. But eventually, through all of these fighting and evolution, Horus becomes a better ruler. He becomes a better man. The fact that we are faced with trials in our human life is to allow us to grow, outgrow them, or choose a better choice, or choose a different choice. So sometimes you'll identify patterns in your life and you say, why does this keep happening to me? And my question is, well, why haven't you learned from this experience that you need to relive it all the time? So you can just toss away all responsibility, or you can ask yourself, what do I need to learn from this? And then grow, just like Horus did. In the temple of Kumambo is where this alchemical marriage would take place for the initiates. The shift from ego to soul's purpose. In order to reawaken this heart-mind connection. Now, in many of the books that I've read, they talk about this heart-mind connection, meaning the conscious and the subconscious. I keep telling people say, oh, I know this, but I can't do it. I know this, but I keep sabotaging myself. This represents a disconnection between your mind and your heart. So now the work of the initiates was to examine their own heart and to see, what is this battle that the light and the dark are fighting within me, that even though I know better, I can't actually do or act the way I want to. So Seth is not evil. He simply volunteered as a shadow to teach Horus to become a better ruler, a better person, and a better human. In the same way, there are people in our lives that, could be described as troublemakers or saboteurs, but in the end, they are there to help us grow, to help us understand. In some cases, they're there for us to learn about love and compassion and forgiveness to others. So instead of judging the experience, we need to take a step back and become a witness to this whole story and view our life as a story and ask ourselves, so why does my main character keep doing this? Shouldn't it do something different if you want to expect a different outcome? And that's what the initiate had to go through at this point. The actual transformation of this marriage was performed by Sekhmet. Sekhmet is the lioness, and she's got fierce compassion, and she's a great healer. And this is what it's all about. Healing and merging the light and the dark within you is about healing what you're afraid of, is about healing your deep wounds that you experience either in a past life or in the childhood. In order to transform them and heal them, Sekhmet teaches us about compassion. And so it's a time where the initiate will learn about forgiveness, about grounding, about understanding. There was an expectation of maturity to occur at this point. I met Sekhmet in the chapel inside the temple of Karnak. And it was very interesting because we had an uneven number in our group. So I was the last one to go, and I was alone in the room with her. And I entered very reverently, and I closed my eyes, and right away, it's quite an imposing statue of basalt. It's black, and it's at least 7 feet tall. And I heard clearly, "Open your eyes." I was like, "Oh, okay." Did not expect that. And she talked to me, and she's like, "Don't be a fool. Don't have false humility. You're here before me. What is your question? What do you want? What do you need to transform?" And so Sekhmet is very, in that sense, very fierce. She's very upfront. If you present yourself before her, she expects you to have been prepared and to answer the questions. Otherwise, the moment is lost. So I was very, very happy that I already had everything I had. My intention was prepared in my mind. So when she asked the question, the answer came right away. She works on your solar plexus. With the initiates, this is when they would find their purpose, their power, their gifts, their talents. So we're talking about initiates, but we're talking about a long time in transforming. This isn't something that someone would do in like a month. Just the final initiation lasts 3 days. It's written somewhere that Plato studied for 13 years before you could achieve the transformation in the pyramid. So depending on your own speed, depending on your intention, depending on how you're devoted to this, it could take less or longer time. The advantage that the initiates had is that they lived in the temple, and they had to eventually come out and work outside and be tempted and prove that they were true to the way, and they could come back and enter the second initiation round. However, during their progress, they were in isolation and in some sort of protection, in a sense. And so I would say the evolution was much faster. But in our today time, when I'm working with people and they come and then I don't see them for 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, it's not surprising that it takes several years for a person to arrive to the same place. Depending on your dedication, the amount of work that you're willing to put in on a personal basis, your regularity of your exercise, it makes the whole difference on how fast or slow you're going to be progressing through this. So finally, you come out of this chaos and you work with Ma'at. This is the card of justice. It's the card of truth. This is a card where you are actually finally bridging the two hearts into one. You need to look at yourself in order for this to happen and to accept who you are. Accept that everyone is the same as you. They're all souls. So there's a two-part aspect to it, is that you have to accept people, you have to love people, but you also, on the second hand, you have to accept yourself and you have to love yourself. Once this transformation or this adjustment is done, which is the truth of all things, then there's the marriage of this balance of the two hearts, and they start beating as one. In the Book of the Dead, this is where the heart would be weighed and read by Anubis, and that the judgment would be delivered by Thoth, the older wisdom. And so those two, the light and the dark, are within you. So as you look at yourself, you have to be honest, because skipping a step and trying to hide the truth would be useless, because eventually you can't go on anymore, because the harmonies and the frequencies required in your energetic field to progress wouldn't be there. So then would come the time for the hermit. The hermit is guided by Thoth, the god of wisdom of the earth and sky, of writing and teaching. He helps the initiate to convert their knowledge into their own wisdom. This is a time where now you've been learning, you've been on the journey for quite some time, and eventually you can't just keep learning and taking classes and just pushing. There has to be a time when you take a step back and you say, okay, now I've learned about tarot, I've learned about mediumship, I've learned about energy through Reiki, I've learned about past lives, I learned about shamanism. Now, what does this all mean? You have to make sense of it all. You have to unify it all. This is the time where the initiates would have to take to convert all that knowledge into wisdom. You see, knowledge and wisdom are two different things. Knowledge is knowing things. That doesn't mean that because you know something that you can rightfully apply it or that you can make sense of it. Wisdom is when you understand how things work. And so even though I may use different terms than you do, I'm still able to explain the functioning of what's underneath of it all. And so because I understand the function of it, I'm able to apply it. This was done at the Temple of Memphis. It was a huge complex that's now basically destroyed and doesn't really exist anymore. But it had many spheres of activities where the initiate could do this work and develop their purpose. Then went on to the wheel. Now, the wheel is your final step of the first cycle of the initiate. The wheel is about the period where you need to use proper energy, respecting the cycle of nature. You know, you wouldn't plant in the winter. It's useless. In the same way, as a human, you need to respect your own nature. Personally, I work best between 10 a.m. to about midnight. That's my time. If I respect that nature of mine, everything is great. I'm always happy, I'm always rested, and I always have energy. However, if I'm forced to get up really early in the morning, then it's harder for me because that's not my cycle. So the initiates had to learn their own cycle through nature, through their activity of rest and learning and integrating. And they would do so at Memphis because that's where they would be challenged. They'd still be in a complex, but the complex was so large. There was a lot of interaction, a lot of people. And so therefore came a lot of challenges or possible opportunities for regressing or growing. It's also the point where the initiates are going to be able to advance to a higher level, to climb the second sphere of growth. The higher octave means the deeper mysteries. In the Toltecs, there's two classes of students, the two classes of knights. If you recall, there's the lower and the higher form. The higher form was the eagles. In the Egyptian, there was also these two different categories, the initiates and the adepts, meaning that they have the basic of the knowledge, and now they're applying the basic of the knowledge into further growing their abilities and then expanding it to the outside. The first phase is usually about healing yourself. When I do a soul reading, there's a growth chart that you need to qualify yourself on where you're at. It's 0 to 50% or 50 to 100. In order to guide people, I usually tell them, you first have to master the 0 to 50, which means mastering yourself, before you can go outside in the community into the world, and then mastering, sharing what you have to share with the world. That's the 50 to 100%. So at this stage, this is where they would finalize their own healing and start sharing with others. In order to do so, they required a certain strength, because now it's very easy to mislead people. It's very easy to, try to convince people. The mystery school in Egypt was not about convincing people. It was about helping people grow, helping finding people their own power. So it's very important at this point that you have your own spiritual power and that you're able to pursue and master the secret wisdom. And so this power, when you're in creative mode, creativity will bring about beautiful things in a sacred way. Creativity is all about letting the soul talk through you, through what you're creating. It doesn't matter that you're creating a flower arrangement or that you're creating a poem or that you're creating a piece of art. But this is the point where the output of your strength and your effort and your energy and your passion comes through as a message from the soul. The initiates also required a lot of strength to keep living in a higher consciousness state. And this is not easy to do. I was able to reach the higher consciousness state when I was in Peru. And after 3 days, I was able to stay in that space. But you're easily bumped off. And then you have to reset yourself all the time. And this is what the initiate at this point in time had to keep doing. Having lived in a time and space where everything is perfect and everything is harmonized and the highest spiritual energy accompany you, to being bumped off and entering Memphis and seeing the chaos around you and having to arrive on time somewhere, to meet people, to and stay focused on all of those things while you're still trying to run through you the higher energies. And so this period was a period of strengthening for the initiate. In the Book of the Dead, this is when the dead is about to re-enter darkness. They first go into darkness and then they graduate into the light. But eventually, after traveling through the light, they must re-enter darkness. What does this mean? It means that now, as the initiate has been seen in the light and he's figured out that he's a being made of light, he's now got to re-enter the material world and be confronted by people who are not so much enlightened necessarily, and having to deal with them who are not necessarily in a loving, compassionate kind of energy, and trying to navigate this world, which is the darkness that they're about to descend into. Descending into darkness is descending into matter. It's descending away from the spirit. It's descending away from the light of God. That's where you go when you leave, let's say, a class and you feel great and you're energized and you go to work the next day and you're like, why am I back here? What, where's that loving energy? It's a different energy. It's a different place. It's different people. So you need to find your own personal strength to restore that energy and to send you back in order to keep connected. And so through meditation, through a walk in the woods, through a walk in nature, in order to be able to communicate these energy through you and boost your own inner energy. Now, as you do that, you have an awakening. That's the hangman. The hangman represents a change in perspective, and you have no choice but to change your perspective. You're looking at the world differently because now we're soul-infused being and we don't have to succumb to this. Why are we treating people this way? You see the pain and suffering and you realize that your own pain and suffering. And you have to navigate the learning of how do I transform this without necessarily manipulating people or taking people out of their regular life. You have to help them integrate this knowledge, right? And so that's when you arrive to the releasing of your old belief and finally able to see the death of ego. You realize that this suffering is no longer necessary, and so you're ready to let go of your ego. So this is the card of death in the tarot. You release your human and animalistic nature of pleasure of the senses, and you accept your divinity, and you take responsibility. You take responsibility for your knowledge. You take responsibility for your actions, your thoughts, your words. You are then ready to be reborn in a new higher energy of purpose and guidance. A life that's going to be now filled with joy, laughter, and peace, which is what is the fifth agreement of the Toltec teaching, heaven on earth. Now, we enter the cards of balance or temperance. And this is where Aethor graces us with fierce grace. It brings us back to Dendera, where the Aethor guide us in expressing our new self, our new truth, through songs, poetry, writing, and dancing. Again, more creativity, more impulses of life filtering through us. The expression of light is love. And it's now a time for us to learn the balance between this physical world. So we struggle with it at first, and now we're learning the balance of it all. And the need for the higher learning, the higher energy, to be able to continue functioning in the lower field energy. It's a transformation of like the lump of coal into the diamond. As knowing the diamond was inside of you all this time, and now through shedding of the ego, you shed the coal around the diamond. And so you're allowed to evolve at your own pace, but now you're balancing and letting others evolve at their own pace without judgment, without agenda. You're just now this light into the world. You're a way shower, or you're a light bringer, or you're a warrior of light, whichever term you see fit. You become the expression of this light into the other world. Now, the devil card is ego. In Egyptian myth, it's Set or Sobek. All of the past karma, or the childhood wounds that your ego was protecting, are now open. You see, as you shed the protector, which is the ego in the death, now you are looking at these wounds. Now, let it be said, I'm respecting the order of which the tarot is numbered nowadays, but personally, I think that you have to see the devil and then see the death of the ego. And in one of the theories is that the numbers and the cards were voluntarily mixed to hide the mysteries from the people. But either way, the devil card means that you must see those wounds, because although the wounds are being protected by ego, they're not healing. They just keep festering inside of you. So until you can finally look at them, and maybe you do need the death of the ego, the death of the protector, to be able to now finally actually look at the abyss and at those wounds that are inside of you, to finally heal them. And in order to do that, in order to heal those wounds, it's true forgiveness, which is the higher aspect of love. So at one point I said you must love yourself, and now the highest representation of this love for yourself is the forgiveness. There was a time for the initiate to show their shadow nature, that they kept it in, and progress through this healing. Set personifies the limitation imposed by the physical reality and our constant struggle to overcome them. So they understand that it's a struggle, and it's not easy. In the in the groups that I have, the students that come and work with me, they call me and they say, this is hard for me. I'm having a hard time with this. And I understand. So there's no judgment there. The pain is real and the effect is real. So as if you enter in trust in a place that you know that you feel safe, which is what the initiates were provided for in the Abydos temple, then you go on to this exploration and this healing. Then enters the Tower of Life Experience. The tower or the life experience is guided by Wadjet. Wadjet is letting you know that now that ego is gone, that your past is gone, you're walking away from this old beliefs, this old structure that was holding you prisoner.